This Jeskai deck is built for value and is constructed to utilize and abuse the static effects of its general. For the purposes of gaining the biggest bang for our manaless bucks, numerous X spells are included in the 99. Since the cost of our spells is reduced by 1 generic mana for each of its targets, casting spells with X targets ensures the greatest possible impact on the game. Also, the tax on our opponent's spells further widens the resource gap. This synergy provides a nearly effortless management of the battlefield by turning minimal mana investments into game-changing returns. In order to strengthen and enhance the spell-slinging focus of this deck, various spells that provide added benefits to our aforementioned value dynamic are included. With this resource engine consistently outvaluing our opponents, victory eventually is achieved through combat or direct damage.
Welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. Hinata Dawncrowned is a 4/4 legendary Kirin spirit with flying and trample for 1 in Jeskai colors. Spells we cast cost 1 less to cast for each target. Spells our opponents cast cost 1 more to cast for each target. The following deck tech is going to demonstrate a very dedicated and enhanced way to take full advantage of Hinata's taxing and cost reduction abilities. The following cards are categorized into 2 different groups. We have a group of protection spells as a way in which to make sure that Hinata stays on the battlefield and under the skin of our opponents. And the second group of cards are going to be referred to as our disruption cards. These are going to be spells that are going to synergize with Hinata as a way in which to disrupt our opponent's plans. Starting with protection, let's talk about our first spell, Eerie Interlude. It's 2 and a white at instant speed. However, when we have Hinata on the battlefield and at least 1 other creature, we're only ever going to pay 1 white mana for this spell. And when we do, we exile any number of target creatures we control. So as long as we have Hinata and another creature at least, we're only going to pay 1 white mana because we have 2 targets. We return the exile cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. This is a fantastic way to prevent any kind of spot or mass removal, ensuring that we keep Hinata on the battlefield doing what Hinata wants to do. Another spell somewhat similar to Eerie Interlude, also at instant speed, we have Ghostly Flicker, 2 and a blue, but again, if we read the text on the bottom, exile 2 target artifacts, creatures, and or lands we control, and then return those cards to the battlefield under our control. We don't even need an additional creature to cast Ghostly Flicker for only 1 blue mana. As long as Hinata and a land is there, then we only have to pay 1 blue. We blink Hinata out of the line of fire for any potential spot removal spells. Also, a good way in which to perform some combat shenanigans. Next up, to protect Hinata, we have Fierce Guardianship. We don't even have to worry about any mana cost as long as we have Hinata on the battlefield and under our control, because if we do so, we can cast this spell without paying its mana cost. And when we do cast it, we counter target non-creature spell. Just another in a long list of ways to protect Hinata. Same verse as the first, we have Deflecting Swat. Again, if we control Hinata, this spell will be free as long as we have our commander on the battlefield. And when we do cast a Deflecting Swat, we may choose new targets for target spell or ability. Another way to keep Hinata on the battlefield. Next protection spell, we have Semester's End. 3 and a white at instant speed, but we are never going to pay 3 and a white. We exile any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers we control. Spoiler alert, there are no planeswalkers in this deck, so this is going to be all about Hinata and any other creatures that are on the battlefield and under our control. At the beginning of the next end step, we return the exiled creatures to the battlefield under our control, and then they enter the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it if it's a creature, and if we had any planeswalkers, it would also enter with an additional loyalty counter. But again, no planeswalkers in this deck, so what we're just looking for is Hinata and 2 other creatures, and we're tapping just 1 white mana to make sure that we protect our general from being sent to the command zone. Next protection spell, we have Mystic Confluence. Instant speed 3 and 2 blue, but at the most, we're really only ever going to pay 2 blue mana, because we get to choose any 3 of the following modes, and we may choose the same mode more than once. We can counter a target spell unless its controller pays 3. Notice that it's the target. It doesn't have to be a creature. It doesn't have to be an artifact. This is a target, so Hinata will reduce the cost so Hinata will reduce the mana cost of this spell by 1 for each target. So if you want to be really, really mean, you can pay 2 blue mana and counter a target spell unless its controller pays 9 blue mana. Or we can return target creature to its owner's hand as well. Or we can draw a card. Just be careful if you so choose to draw a card as one of the modes in casting Mystic Confluence. That is not a target, so you will be paying the 1 generic mana cost in addition to the 2 blue. So suffice it to say, depending on how the board state is, your metagame, and exactly what you want to do, you're probably just going to pay 2 blue mana, return a creature, maybe counter a spell, make the controller pay 6. That's going to be up to you. Next spell is Sublime Epiphany, 4 and 2 blue at instant speed, but again, we are never going to pay that much mana for this spell, because with Hinata on the battlefield, we can reconcile a way to cast Sublime Epiphany for just 2 blue mana. And this is why. We can choose 1 or more of the following modes. We have 5 that we can pick, and every one of them has a target. Counter target spell. Counter target activated or triggered ability. Return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. Create a token that's a copy of target creature we control, and target player draws a card. So imagine the power of just paying 2 blue mana, countering an ability, bouncing a permanent, a non-land permanent, creating a token of a creating a token that's a copy of target creature we control, and we draw a card, all for 2 blue mana at instant speed. With Hinata on the battlefield, that is a very real reality. All right, next protection spell, we have March of Swirling Mist, X and a blue at instant speed. And it does say as an additional cost to cast this spell, we may exile any number of blue cards from our hand, and this spell will cost 2 less to cast for each card exiled this way. We will never do this. Not one time ever. I can't imagine a scenario where we're going to cast this spell that way, because with Hinata on the battlefield, every one of our targets is going to be free. So we're just going to pay 1 blue mana, and we're going to have X target creatures phase out. Can you imagine, just imagine the versatility and practicality of this spell in so many different ways in a game. At the end of your last opponent's turn, pay a blue mana and phase out every single one of our opponent's creatures, leaving the entire battlefield wide open for us to swing in and win. We can also use this for defensive purposes. We can prevent any of our creatures from dying to any type of board wipe. All at instant speed, all for 1 blue mana, as long as our general is on the battlefield and under our control. And our last protection spell that we're going to talk about in this group is Disorder in the Court. We have an instant speed spell, X, white and a blue. We exile target creature. So let's pause right there. All we have to do is pay a blue and a white, and then we get to exile any number of creatures. Not creatures we control, any number of creatures. So there's so much versatility in this spell, just like there is and was with March of Swirling Mist. So after we exile those creatures, we get to investigate X times. So we get to put a clue into play for each one of the creatures that we exile. Then we return the exile cards to the battlefield tapped and under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So just imagine again the versatility of this spell. End of your last opponent's turn, cast Disorder in the Court, have all of their creatures get exiled. We investigate. They don't return to play until the beginning of our end step, which would be our next turn. And again, just like March of Swirling Mist, this also has defensive capabilities as well. As in, we can prevent any of our creatures, particularly Hinata, from any kind of spot removal or board wipes. All right, so those are the protection spells. Now let's talk about some ways in which we're going to disrupt our opponents, because they're going to do everything they can to prevent us from utilizing Hinata's ability. So we're going to make sure that we can return the favor in kind. And the first spell we're going to talk about is Ether Gale. Sorcery speed 3 and 2 blue. Return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hand. With Hinata in play, this is 2 blue mana to bounce 6 non-land permanents. The resource advantage with this build is going to be so overwhelming that we should easily be able to control the entire game and then just outvalue our opponents every step of the way. Here's another example of the resources that we're going to have available to us. Magma Opus, instant speed 6 blue and a red. Now let's count down the potential number of targets when casting this spell. Magma Opus deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of targets. So 4 targets right there reduces the spell to 2 blue and a red. Then we can tap 2 target permanents. Now we're casting this spell for a blue and a red mana with Hinata on the battlefield. We also get to create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token, and we draw 2 cards. So for the investment of a blue and a red mana with Hinata on the battlefield, we're spreading 4 points of damage to 4 targets, we're tapping down 2 permanents, creating a 4/4 creature, and we're drawing 2 cards. The resource advantage in this deck is off the charts. Next disruption spell, we have Icy Blast, instant speed, X and a blue, tap X creatures. So again, for the purposes of this deck, with Hinata on the battlefield, X is going to be free. As a bonus, this spell has the ferocious mechanic, meaning if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, we'll slowly slide down Icy Blast to reveal that, yes, Hinata is a 4/4. So if we cast this spell in the presence of our beloved general, creatures that are tapped this way will not untap during their controller's next untap steps. Icy Blast could be used as a 1 step away from winning the game. Next spell up, we have this Reality Spasm. This is listed under the disruption spells, but there's a little added versatility here that could really factor into our resource engine. We have X and double blue, and we get to pick one of the following 2 modes. Either we tap X target permanents, or we untap X target permanents. So for the purposes of defense, of course, we just cast this to tap down every single permanent that our opponents control, and then we can pretty much just do whatever we want during our turn. However, if we take a more offensive look at this card, this is a way in which we can practically double all of our mana available. We tap out, leaving 2 blue mana floating, and then we cast Reality Spasm, untapping every one of our mana-producing permanents. That gives us the ability to cast even more spells synergizing with Hinata, and pretty much just run the opponents right off the table. Next up, we have Distorting Wake. Sorcery speed, X and triple blue. Return X non-land permanents to their owner's hands. For the purposes of this deck with Hinata, we're going to treat this spell as Cyclonic Rift. Yes, it's not instant speed, it's only sorcery speed, but we only need 3 blue mana to cast a sorcery speed Cyclonic Rift. I will take that exchange every day of the week and twice on Friday Night Magic. All right, 2 more disruption spells, and then this subsection of the deck tech will be over. Next, we have Blatant Thievery, 4 and triple blue at sorcery speed. For each opponent, we gain control of target permanent that player controls. If we're sitting down to a traditional 4-player EDH table, we're going to invest 1 generic mana and 3 blue to pick the 3 best permanents we can reconcile, 1 from each of our opponents. And lastly, in this subsection, we have mass manipulation. So here's the trick with the double X as it synergizes with Hinata. When we have 2 X's, one of the X's just disappears. So what we're looking at when casting mass manipulation, as long as we have Hinata on the battlefield, is paying quadruple blue and X. But with Hinata, the second X is not going to, we don't have to worry about the second X. So we're going to gain control of X target creatures and or permanents. So as long as we can reconcile including a quadruple colored spell in a 3-color deck, and when we get to the land base, you'll see that that will be a lot more realistic than it may sound here. However, for the ability to just, fill X and gain any number of creatures and or planeswalkers, mass manipulation could be considered one of the win conditions in this deck. The following cards in this subsection of the video also are going to be categorized in 2 ways. We have our direct damage spells, which are going to synergize with Hinata in such a powerful way that each one of them could almost be considered a win condition. The second group is going to be our removal spells. Most of those spells are also going to synergize with Hinata fantastically, while others are just too valuable to keep out of the deck even if they have no synergy with Hinata at all. Let's begin with our direct damage spell, and the first one we're going to talk about is Soulfire Eruption. 6 and triple red, but we are never going to pay that much for this spell. This spell will almost always just cost 3 red mana. We choose any number of target creatures, planeswalkers, or players. For each of them, we exile the top card of our library, then Soulfire Eruption deals damage equal to that card's converted mana cost to that permanent or player. If that was all this card did, it might be on the fringe of being included or laying on the floor after chops. However, the next couple lines is what really seals the deal for inclusion into the 99 of this deck. We may play the exile cards until the end of our next turn. So what this really entails is we get the ability to spread around all kinds of potential damage to every single target that we want, and we get to pretty much draw all of those cards into an exiled hand that we could cast next turn. And that's all for 3 red mana. Soulfire Eruption is going to be one of the very sneaky good cards in this deck. Next up, we have Comet Storm. Instant speed, X, and 2 red with a multi-kicker of 1. Flashing back when we were talking about mass manipulation, and how we talked about a spell with double X with Hinata in play, one of the X's will not be considered in the casting cost because of Hinata's reduction. For Comet Storm, the multi-kicker here, we're not going to have to worry about the multi-kicker because each multi-kicker is just adding a target to the overall cost of the spell. Hinata negates each one of those multi-kicker activations, so we get to fling X damage at any number of targets just like that. We can consider Comet Storm to be one of the win conditions in this deck, particularly if you think about the synergies it could have with Reality Spasm. Next card up, we have Jared's Belligerent, sorcery speed X and double red. Jared's Belligerence will deal X damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures. Whenever a creature dealt damage this way dies, we get to populate. So a little bit of a spoiler here when we're talking about this card. Creature tokens are going to be one of the ways in which we can win in this deck. More on that later in the deck tech. What we're looking for here with Jared's Belligerence is to pay 2 red mana and have the ability to ping any number of creatures that are on the battlefield. Each one of them is going to take 1 point of damage, and each time one of those creatures dies, we get to populate, which means we get to create a token that's a copy of a creature token we already control. Again, more on the creature tokens in this deck later during this video. And if we need to get rid of a couple of other problematic creatures that are causing trouble on the battlefield, then we can inflate the mana of X by actually paying real mana into the spell to make sure that those creatures also go to the graveyard. Next spell up, we have Aurelius Fury. X, red and a white at instant speed. Aurelius Fury will deal X damage divided as we choose among any number of target creatures and or players. We tap each creature dealt damage this way. Players dealt damage this way can't cast non-creature spells this turn. This is a win condition for us. We will amass our token army. We will cast Aurelius Fury. We will deal 1 point of damage to every one of our opponent's creatures and 1 point of damage to each opponent, all for just 1 red and 1 white mana. They can't cast any non-creature spells, which allows us to have Hinata protected even further, as well as to ensure that there's going to be no combat shenanigans on the defensive side of our opponents. All of this for a red and a white mana in the presence of Hinata. Next direct damage spell, we have Meteor Blast. Sorcery speed, X and triple red. This deals 4 damage to each of X target creatures and or players. This spell is ridiculous. This is the real deal when we're talking about trying to get rid of creatures. All we need to invest in this spell, as long as Hinata's on the battlefield, is triple red. And every one of those 4 points of damage is going to go to each target, and we don't need to inflate any more mana into this spell. Every one of our opponent's creatures and every one of our opponents are each going to take 4 points of damage, all for just 3 red mana. Next Meteor spell, it's a sorcery. It is X and triple red, but this one is Meteor Swarm. It deals 8 damage divided as we choose among X target creatures and or planeswalkers. So again, the targets that we have to pay are free thanks to Hinata's reduction ability. So we throw 3 red mana into the spell, and we just make sure we divide that 8 damage accordingly and make sure we get rid of any creatures or planeswalkers that are causing us any grief. Our last direct damage spell of this subset of the video can also be considered one of our win conditions. It is Crackle with Power. We have triple X and double red at sorcery speed. So similar to what we talked about with mass manipulation, when we have more than one X, one of the X's is negated because of Hinata's reduction ability. So what we're looking at here is double X, double red to cast this spell, and Crackle with Power will deal 5 times X damage to each of up to X targets. So if you can just imagine what we could do with this spell. Let's make the number a nice even 10 mana. Let's say we float in for the double X. We put in 4 and 4 for double X, and then we have the 2 red. So X is 4. So we're going to deal 5 damage to 5 targets, which is 25 damage to 5 different targets for a total of 10 mana. That is ridiculous. Oh, I'm sorry, I misspoke here a little bit. Not 25, 20. 20 damage. So if we make X and X, 4 and 4, and 2 red for a total of 10, Crackle with Power will deal 5 times 4 damage to each of up to 4 targets. So we're going to deal 20 damage to 4 targets for the investment of 10 mana. Crackle with Power, win condition in this deck. Those are the direct damage spells that are going to synergize wonderfully with Hinata. Here are the removal spells. Removal spell 1 and 2, they're not going to have any synergy with Hinata, but they're just too valuable not to include. It's the best creature removal in the game. 1 white, instant speed, Swords to Plowshares. You know what it does. We don't really care about giving our opponent some extra life because we know that with Hinata, we're going to take it away even quicker. Same thing, we have Path to Exile. It's going to be instant speed. It's going to be 1 white mana. Yes, it's not optimal to gift our opponent with a free basic land if they have any basic lands in their library. However, sometimes the threat on the battlefield is worth giving up that land. Now we're going to shift away from the must-include spells that do not have any synergy with Hinata to some spells that absolutely do. Here is Generous Gift. It's 2 and a white to destroy target permanent, but with Hinata on the battlefield, this is only going to cost us 1 and a white. And we leave behind a 3/3 green elephant creature token, and we don't care. We don't care about a 3/3 token. Not in this deck, not in this format, no chance. Chaos Warp is next. This is 2 and a red, the owner of target permanent. There's that word that we love to see, target. As long as Hinata's on the battlefield, this means that this spell is 1 and 1 red mana. We get to pick a target permanent, they shuffle it into their library, and then they reveal the top card of their library. If it's a permanent, they get to put it into play. Offensive, defensive purposes, Chaos Warp is a great spell to include in the 99 of this deck. Next, we have Return to Dust, instant speed, 2 and 2 white mana, exile target artifact or enchantment. If we cast this spell during our main phase, we may exile up to 1 other target artifact or enchantment. So let's boil this down. We're going to cast this during our main phase almost every single time possible. Just because inflating 4 mana to exile a permanent that's only going to be an artifact or enchantment, that's only done under the most dire of circumstances. If we can get to our turn and we can just pay the 2 white mana during our main phase, we get to save 50% of the mana invested, and we get to pick 2 permanents to exile and not just 1. This spell was more favored over Crush Contraband, which is also a white instant for 3 and a white mana. That lets you pick. That gives you a couple of modes to choose. You can exile target artifact, you can exile target enchantment, or you can exile target artifact and target enchantment. What I liked better about Return to Dust, because let's face it, we're still investing overall 2 mana into the spell, just like we would for Crush Contraband. What I like better about Return to Dust is it gives us the option to double up on the enchantment or double up on the artifact. Crush Contraband does not allow us to do that. It's one or the other or one of each. That's why Return to Dust is in and Crush Contraband is out. All right, next removal spell, we have Volcanic Offering, 4 and a red at instant speed. But you know what, folks? We are only going to pay 1 red mana for this. Watch this spell and watch how wonderful it's going to play out with Hinata. We destroy target non-basic land we don't control and target non-basic land of an opponent's choice that we don't control. So there's 2 lands off the battlefield. That reduces the spell from 4 and a red to 2 and a red. Volcanic Offering deals 7 damage to target creature we don't control, and 7 damage to target creature of an opponent's choice you don't control. There's 2 more targets for a total of 4 targets, making this a 1 red mana spell to remove 2 non-basic lands, and most likely 2 creatures from the battlefield. And the best thing about this is none of our permanents or creatures are going to be touched. We can pit opponent versus opponent, or we can really bring down an opponent that's causing the battlefield some achingly trouble or problematic behaviors. All right, next up we have a very, very powerful spell to talk about, By Force. Sorcery speed, X and a red, destroy X target artifacts. So what we're really going to do, as long as we have Hinata on the battlefield and under our control, we're going to pay a red mana, and we're going to destroy each one of our opponent's artifacts. This is Vandal Blast for 4 less mana. Think about that for a second. Vandal Blast overloaded is 4 and a red mana to destroy each artifact you don't control. With Hinata in play, By Force is 1 red mana to do the exact same thing. This spell may be even more powerful than By Force. We have Heliods Intervention. This is at instant speed. It's X and double white. We get to pick 1 and destroy X target artifacts and or enchantments, and target player gains twice X life. There are going to be very, very few scenarios in which we're going to choose the second mode, particularly in a deck like Hinata, because if we have Hinata on the battlefield, we pay 2 white mana, and this spell changes from destroy X target artifacts and or enchantments to destroy every target artifact and enchantment your opponents control. That is power for 2 white mana. All right, we're down to our last 2 removal spells. Next up, we have Curse of the Swine. X and 2 blue at sorcery speed. We exile X target creatures. And of course, Each one of those X targets is going to be free because of Hinata. For each creature exiled this way, its controller creates a 2/2 green boar creature token. We don't care. We just want the rest of those creatures exiled, and all for only 2 blue mana in the presence of Hinata. And lastly, we have Release the Gremlins, double X and red as sorcery speed. So as we learned earlier, when Hinata's in play, one of those X's is disregarded. So what we really have is X and a red, destroy X target artifacts, and we create X 2/2 red gremlin creature tokens. Here's one of the creature token spells that we are going to add to the 99 of this deck as one of the ways to shape up our win conditions. The following cards are considered some alternate win conditions in the deck. Most of them have to do with creating creature tokens or enhancing those creature tokens for the purposes of combat. And the first spell we're going to talk about is Launch the Fleet. At sorcery speed, we have 1 white mana, but it also has the Strive mechanic. Launch the Fleet costs 1 more to cast for each target beyond the first. So with Hinata in play, this card synergizes perfectly because all we'll ever have to pay is 1 white mana. And when we do, until end of turn, any number of target creatures each gain whenever this creature attacks, we create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, put it onto the battlefield, tapped and attacking. Launch the Fleet is alternate win condition number 1 in this portion of the video. Next, we have Call the Coppercoats, instant speed, 2 and a white mana, but this also has the Strive mechanic as well. This spell will cost 1 and 1 white mana more to cast for each target beyond the first. So if we're sitting down to a traditional game of Magic with 3 EDH opponents, we're going to cast this for a cost reduction of 3 for each of those targets. And when we do, we're going to choose those 3 opponents. We're going to create X 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, where X is the number of creatures those opponents control. So the first opponent will give us a cost reduction of 1, so that's 1 and a white mana, and then each opponent thereafter will be just 1 white mana. So 3 opponents will equal a total of 1 generic and 3 white mana to create an army out of nowhere at instant speed. Next, we have Hour of Need, another instant spell that is also having the Strive mechanic. We have 2 and a blue for the initial cost. Hour of Need costs 1 and 1 blue more to cast for each target beyond the first. So this is the exact same equation as Call the Coppercoats. We exile any number of target creatures, and for each creature exiled this way, its controller puts a 4/4 blue Sphinx creature token with flying onto the battlefield. So whether this is going to be used for defensive purposes to remove more problematic or troublesome creatures from our opponents, or we decide to get rid of our 1/1 soldiers and create 4/4 blue Sphinxes instead, every target after the first is just going to be 1 blue mana, of course, in the presence of our general, Hinata. Next up, we have Divergent Transformations. Instant speed, 6 and a red mana. This has the Undaunted mechanic. This spell will cost 1 less to cast for each opponent. So if we're sitting down to a 4-player EDH game right off the bat, this is 3 and 1 red mana. So this reads exile 2 target creatures. So right there, we're now down to 1 and 1 red mana. We exile 2 target creatures, and for each of those creatures, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and then they shuffle the rest into their library. Yes, there are defensive purposes for this card. However, as you'll see when we move more towards the creatures that are included in this deck, this is most likely going to be cast on one of our less powerful tokens in order for us to get straight from our library 2 of our game-winning creatures. Next spell we have is Open into Wonder. Sorcery speed, X and 2 blue. X target creatures can't be blocked this turn. If the spell ended right there, this would still be included in the 99 of this deck, because with Hinata on the battlefield, this is 2 blue mana to say all of your creatures can't be blocked. That's it, 2 mana. However, it's even better than that. Until end of turn, each of those creatures gain when this creature deals combat damage to a player. We draw a card. Open into Wonder is win condition number 5 in this deck, or in this subset of the video. Next up, we have Indomitable Creativity, X and triple red, but we are only really ever going to pay triple red for the spell as long as we have Hinata on the battlefield. And when we do, we can destroy X target artifacts and or creatures. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller will reveal cards from the top of their library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and exiles that card. Those players put the exile cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle their libraries. For me, and I'm only saying this for me because I have a certain set of guidelines I utilize when creating decks, I am most likely never going to cast this on my opponents. There might be a problematic creature that is just worth taking the risk of having something better come out from their library for free. However, for all intents and purposes, this is going to be pointed in the direction of all of those 1/1 and less powerful creature tokens, because once we do that, we get every artifact and creature from our library out onto the battlefield, and you're going to see that's something that we're going to want to do. All right, speaking of those creatures, here we go. The first one is Young Pyromancer, 1 in a red human shaman for 2 in a 1 body. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, of which this deck is flooded, we get to create a 1/1 red elemental creature token. And these are the tokens that are either going to help us win through combat, delay the game through chump blocking, or be used as sacrificial fodder for some of the other spells we've already talked about. As long as we are constructing and piloting a non-creature spell, well, the majority of the spells are non-creatures, we're also going to have Saheeli Sublime Artificer. Legendary Planeswalker that comes into play with 5 loyalty counters for 1 and any combination of 2 Izzet mana. Whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we create a 1/1 colorless Servo artifact creature token. So this is going to be similar to what Young Pyromancer gives us, except Saheeli opens this up to all non-creature spells and not just instant and sorceries. We can also -2 Saheeli to have target artifact we control become a copy of another target artifact or creature we control until end of turn, but that's not really going to come up too much. She's really included here for her ability to churn out these attacking in mass, chump blocking, sacrificial 1/1 tokens. All right, here we go. The first of our heavy hitting creatures that we want onto the battlefield when we have Hinata and we're casting all of these magnificently large spells for such paltry amounts of mana. Zaphi, Thunder Conductor. 2 and Izzet colors for a 1/4 legendary human shaman. It has the Mage Craft ability. Whenever we cast or copy, we're only going to be casting spells in this deck, so whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we scry 1. If that spell's mana value is 5 or greater, we scry 1 and we create a 4/4 blue and red elemental creature token. If the spell's mana value is 10 or greater, and as we have demonstrated with the synergy that Hinata has with all of the various X spells that we have in this deck, getting an instant or sorcery spell with a CMC of 10 is not going to be hard at all. And when we do that, then that means that Sapphire Thunder Conductor is going to deal 10 damage to an opponent chosen at random. Listen, we're okay with the randomness of the 10 damage getting floated around because, let's face it, we're going to be casting so many instant and sorcery spells with that much free mana that we're going to just whittle our opponent's life down every single time. And each time that we do have one of these spells that are 10 or more, we're throwing around 10 damage, we're creating a 4/4, and we're scrying 1. Zaphi Thunder Conductor is one of those creatures that we want on the battlefield through the purposes of our sacrificial token engine. Speaking of that sacrificial token engine, we have to include a copy of Kaikar Wind's Fury, 3/3 legendary bird wizard with flying for 1 in Jeskai colors. Whenever we cast a non-creature spell, a la Saheeli, we create a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. Now, since these tokens have flying, we're a little less hesitant to sacrifice them to any of the other spells we were talking about. That evasion can work wonders when we're trying to win via combat. We also have the benefit of sacrificing a spirit to add a red mana to our mana pool. So Kaikar Wind's Fury gives us a lot of options for things that we're doing in the deck by casting all of these non-creature spells. All right, next up we have Deka, Fractal Theorist, 4 and a blue for a 3/3 human wizard. That is legendary. It also has the Magecraft mechanic. Whenever we cast or copy, again, we're just going to be casting, whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we create a 0/0 green and blue fractal creature token and put X +1/+1 counters on it, where X is that spell's mana value. So can you imagine, with all of the X spells that we've already showcased in conjunction with Hinata on the battlefield, can you imagine how big those can you imagine how big these fractal creature tokens are going to be with all those +1/+1 counters? Now, yes, they don't have evasion, but as you've seen, we've already put some cards in here to help out with that by tapping our opponent's creatures, by giving our creatures unblockability, and plus, if needed, it's a little pricey, but Deka has a built-in unblockability mechanic by giving target creature token that can't be blocked this turn. All right, 2 spells left in this subsection of the video. The next one is Metallurgic Summonings. It's an enchantment, 3 and 2 blue. Whenever we cast an instant or sorcery spell, we create an XX colorless construct artifact creature token, where X is that spell's mana value. So just like that, it's pretty similar to what Deka does. It's a little more limited by just being... No, that's exactly what Deka does, because it's instant or sorcery spells. So it's exactly what we were looking for here, because those big instant and sorcery spells are what's going to help us win the game. We can also pay 3 and 2 blue mana and exile Metallurgic Summonings, and we can return all of our instant and sorcery cards from our graveyard to our hand. We can only do that if we control 6 or more artifacts. That should not be a problem, particularly because we have Saheeli and we have a number of artifacts that we haven't gotten to yet, which will show up later in this deck tech. And lastly, we have another enchantment. It is Shark Typhoon, 5 and a blue. Whenever we cast a non-creature spell, we're going to create an XX blue shark creature token with flying, where X is that spell's converted mana cost. This is the big stuff right here, folks, because it's a non-creature spell. So it's every single thing that we can possibly cast in this deck. There are very, very few creature spells, as you have seen. So getting Shark Typhoon into play without any interaction, it will only be a matter of time until our opponents succumb to our flying fish of death. And as a bonus, if needed, we can also cycle Shark Typhoon by paying X, 1 and a blue. And if we do, we're going to draw that card and create an XX blue shark creature token with flying. The following spells are our miscellaneous spells. These are the spells that are going to help us to optimize, enhance, and strengthen everything that we're trying to do in the deck in conjunction with our general, Hinata Dawncrowned. And of course, if we're so reliant on having Hinata in play, we have to offer some further protection. Spell number 1 is Swiftfoot Boots. Equipment costs 2, 1 to equip. An equipped creature has hexproof and haste. In this instance, I prefer Swiftfoot Boots to Lightning Greaves, because with Lightning Greaves, the Shroud means that we could not target Hinata. So if we had, for example, a Lightning Greaves equipped to Hinata, that helps to ward off spot removal. However, if there's a global board wipe and we have, let's say, Eerie Interlude in our hand, we could not target Hinata with an Eerie Interlude and preserve Hinata from being sent to the command zone. However, if we have a Swiftfoot Boots equipped to Hinata, the Hexproof allows us to do that. So the Hexproof will still prevent the spot removal, but it will also allow us to target Hinata to save Hinata from any global removal as well. Paying the 1 extra mana to equip versus the 0 it would take to equip Lightning Greaves is manageable in this deck, particularly because of all of the reduction we have in all of the spells we're casting. All right, miscellaneous spell number 2 is Solve the Equation. Sorcery speed, 2 and a blue. This is our Fabricate for instant or sorcery spells. We're going to cast this, we're going to tutor up an instant or sorcery spell, and we're going to put it right into our hand. With Hinata on the battlefield, we can look to this spell as a bridge to our game-winning spell. That's a lot of spells. All right, next up we have Ley Line of Anticipation, enchantment, 2 and 2 blue. If this is in our opening hand, of course, we can begin the game with this on the battlefield, and this gives spells we cast flash. That means that we can cast any spell in our hand at any time, at any point during the game. Why not include Ley Line of Anticipation? We're playing blue. Maybe it's in our opening hand. That the odds are small, but it's still possible. Besides, you've seen the number of very powerful sorcery spells that we have. If we're able to utilize them to the best of their ability by casting them end of turn and then untap and just cast another spell and just win the game, not including Ley Line of Anticipation is harder to explain than including it. Next up, we have Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. 3/1 legendary human rogue for 3 and a blue mana. We may have Sakashima ETB as a copy of another creature we control, except it has Sakashima of 1,000's other abilities. The legend rule does not apply to permanents we control. Although it may be tempting to have Sakashima come down and copy Hinata, that's not really going to be as beneficial to us as it would be to copy creatures like Kaikar, or maybe Deka, or maybe Zaphi. Can you imagine having Sakashima come into play as a copy of Zaphi, and then the legend rule doesn't apply? So now we're slinging around 20 points of damage whenever we cast one of these overinflated instant or sorcery spells. Good things for Sakashima. That is such an interestingly powerful synergy that we want to include it again with Spark Double. Spark Double is going to do pretty much the same thing that Sakashima does, although it does come in with an additional +1/+1 counter, and also allows us to... I just realized I made an error earlier in this video saying that there were no Planeswalkers in this deck. Saheeli is in this deck. I made an error, so just go back and blast me in the comment section for that. Wow, I don't even know my own deck. I said no Planeswalkers, but Saheeli is in play. Oh, okay, so we can have Spark Double come down as a copy just like Sakashima does, but it's going to get a +1/+1 counter. The copy is not going to be legendary, and this could also come down as a copy of Saheeli. We'll get double the servos, but more importantly, we're looking to copy one of the aforementioned creatures that we talked about when we were talking about Sakashima. Yes, there is a Planeswalker in this deck. It is Saheeli. What a mistake. Oh my goodness. I don't even know my own deck. All right, miscellaneous spell number 6. Let's draw some cards by asking our opponents if they want to pay 1 for that. And can you imagine if this is out on the battlefield in conjunction with Hinata and they're casting the inflated tax to target with their spells, and then we throw an additional tax with Rhystic Study? They're not going to know what to do. Yes, they will. They'll let us draw the card. All right, speaking of drawing cards when we're casting spells, let's play with Archmage Emeritus. 2/2 human wizard for 2 and 2 blue mana. Whenever we cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, we're going to draw a card. Again, we're not copying any spells, but we are going to be casting them. And each time we do, Archmage Emeritus will trigger and we will draw a card. Again, casting spells, drawing cards. Let's continue with that trend and play with a copy of Whirlwind of Thought, an enchantment for 1 in Jeskai colors. Whenever we cast a non-creature spell, which is nearly every spell in this deck, we draw a card. All right, we are just about done. We are going to include a little bit of graveyard synergy here in a Jeskai deck. How are we going to do that? Oh, I'm so glad that you asked. We're going to include a copy of Underworld Breach. It is an enchantment for 1 in a red, and it will allow each non-land card in our graveyard to have escape. The escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost, plus we exile 3 other cards from our graveyard. So let's just look at that for a moment. With so many of our X spells having 1, 2, or 3 mana symbols in their casting cost, having Underworld Breach in play is only going to make that so much easier. Can you imagine the synergy that we're going to get from recasting those cards from our graveyard? We're only going to get the 1 shot to do it, because at the beginning of our end step, we have to sacrifice Underworld Breach. So this, for a turn, opens up our graveyard to be an extension of our hand as long as we have enough cards in that graveyard. And since we are a traditional Jeskai spell slinging deck, it seems very reasonable to think that we will have that full graveyard because each escaped card is going to cost us 3 other cards. All right, next card up, we have Shreds of Sanity. It is a sorcery for 2 and a red, but we're not going to pay 2 and a red. We're going to pay just 1 red if we have Hinata on the battlefield and under our control. We get to return up to 1 target instant card and up to 1 target sorcery card from our graveyard to our hand, and then we discard a card. So we're really only going to pay 1 red mana to return target instant and sorcery card from our graveyard to our hand. Yes, we do have to discard a card, but that's not going to be terrible because depending on where the game is, the board state, what we need to do, we could simply just discard one of the cards we brought to our hand for the purposes of utilizing the other card to win the game. We also have to exile Shreds of Sanity. All of that for just 1 red mana seems very, very reasonable. And lastly, our final miscellaneous spell is Reconstruct History. It is sorcery speed, it's 2 and Boros colors, but we're really only ever going to pay the Boros colors because we get to return up to 1 target artifact card, enchantment card, instant card, sorcery card, and yes, we do have a planeswalker in the deck. It is Saheeli, from our graveyard to our hand. That's 5 targets. So it is extraordinarily likely that we're only going to pay a red and a white mana to return up to 5 cards from our graveyard to our hand. Yes, we do have to exile Reconstruct History, but that's fine. The mana value invested versus what we get in return is off the charts. A red and a white for up to 5 cards. Minimally, I think we can expect to get at least an instant and a sorcery, because with only 1 planeswalker in the deck, that is Saheeli, it's not going to be like we're going to have many planeswalkers hopping into the graveyard, but we will have many, many instant and sorceries, and to get up to 1 each of them back into our hand for a red and a white mana, that makes Reconstruct History possibly one of the best cards in our deck. Particularly if we cast a spell completely eliminating an opponent, and then just cast Reconstruct History, getting that card back, and doing it all over again. And now, as our deck tech comes to a close, we take a moment to review the mana base. We have a handful of mana rocks and 35 lands. Let's start with the best artifact in our format. It is Sol Ring. It is ubiquitous. It is going in. That's pretty much all we're going to say about that artifact. Artifact 1A to Artifact 1B, particularly in a build with 3 colors, is going to be Arcane Signet. This is going to tap to give us a white, a blue, or a red, all of which will be exceedingly necessary as we try to cast spells that have multiple colored mana symbols of the same color. With that being said, we've got Talisman of Conviction in here. It's going to come down for 2 mana. We can tap it for a colorless, or we can tap it to add a red or a white, but it will deal 1 damage to us. And Talisman of Creativity is also going in. It is our Izzet Talisman. It's going to do the same thing, but it's going to be a blue or a red. And once the reprint of the Aurelius Talisman comes down, that will come into play and most likely end up replacing Felwar Stone. We have a pretty good chance of hitting at least one of the colors that we need in our deck. We're playing 3. Of course, we're white, blue, red. It seems reasonable to think that at least one other player at the EDH table will give us one of those 3 colors. Again, we're going to consider Felwar Stone to just be a placeholder for the soon, hopefully, to be reprinted Aurelius Talisman. Next up, we have one of the very best new artifacts to hit our format. Oh, this one is a beauty, and I can't believe it's just an uncommon. Moonsilver Key. It costs 2 to cast. We can pay 1, tap it, sacrifice this to search our library for an artifact card with a mana ability, which I'll just slide right over to the left right now. So any one of those 5 artifacts gets tutored right to our hand. or a basic land right to our hand for the overall investment of 3 mana of any color. Moonsilver Key is going to be one of those cards that's just going to continuously creep up in value because this can go in every single commander deck ever. And what it does is just way too powerful for it to be an uncommon. And our last mana rock, one that's really going to help us to smooth out our mana base, that's going to be Chromatic Lantern. Of course, we're all familiar with Chromatic Lantern. It costs 3. It comes down, gives us one mana of any color, but more importantly, it gives lands we control 1 mana of any color. As you've seen throughout this deck tech, we've had multiple spells, double mana of the same color, triple. One that's even 4 with Mass Manipulation. Chromatic Lantern should be Moonsilver Key target number 1. So those are the mana rocks included in this deck. Now let's talk about the land base. Now the land base is going to be varied because we want to make sure that we spread the colors as evenly as we can so that we can get the biggest bang for our mana buck. So what we're going to see is many, many dual lands and many, many lands that give us more than one color. Very, very few lands that give us just one color, and very, very few lands that give us colorless mana. In fact, we want to make sure that we limit those lands to an as needed basis, or just because the utility is so strong that including it would not be a good idea. So let's begin. We're only playing with a basic land of each. That is it. A plains, an island, and a mountain. Again, we are trying to maximize our land base to give us as many colors necessary as possible, and because of that, we're going to forfeit the basic lands. You let me know in the comment section below how you think that will play out. So let's start unrolling because we have the full complement of some of the best land cycles available to us in this game. We're going to start with one of the newest, and that's going to be what's referred to as the slow land. So we have the Deserted Beach, we have Sundown Pass, and Storm Carved Coast. They each come down untapped as long as we control 2 or more other lands. And this is EDH. We can just keep this bad boy in our hand and play 2 other lands on our first 2 turns if needed, because we know that we're going to have multiple turns to get these lands into play. We can't fetch them, which is unfortunate. However, they do give us one of 2 different colors each time we tap them. And you're going to see a striking trend that we're going to play with as many types of these lands in the deck as possible, because we want to hit on those spells and not be mana restricted in doing so. So the full complement of slow lands, the full complement of fan lands. We've got the Sea of Clouds, Spectator Seating, and Training Center. These will come down untapped as long as we control 2 or more opponents. And if we're sitting down to a game of Commander, we probably want to draw those cards earlier rather than later. Next full complement of shock lands. We've got the Aurelius, we've got the Boros, and we've got the Izzet. All 3 shock lands are going in. They can come into play untapped as long as we pay 2 life when they do so. More importantly, however, we can fetch them if needed. Next full complement, check lands. We've got the Glacial Fortress for Aurelius, we've got the Clifftop Retreat for our Boros, and Sulphur Falls for our Izzet. These will come into play tapped unless we have a specific basic land type among lands we control. Of course, the Aurelius will want to see a plains or an island, the Boros will want to see a mountain or a plains, and of course the Sulphur Falls will want to see a mountain or an island. And if we get those into play, these are going to come into play untapped. Next full complement we have, those are going to be the Pain lands. We have the Adakar Wastes, we have the Battlefield Forge, and we have the Shivan Reef. Each of these lands will tap for a colorless, or they'll tap for one of the colors that we need, and we'll take 1 point of damage. Next up, not necessarily dual lands, but they will help to fix the mana the turn it comes down into play, and that's going to be 1 each of the available pathways. We have the Aurelius pathway here, we have the Boros, and of course we have the Izzet. And each one we have to choose which one of these comes into play, whether we want to have it generate white or blue mana, red or white mana, or blue or red mana, respective to which land we have in our hand when we decide to play it. And once we make that choice, we're going to stick with it. So this will help us fix our mana in the moment, but they do not provide long-term mana fixing, just for whatever we need in that moment. That's what it's going to have to stay. All right, we are just about done with our full complement here. Next up, we are going to have the full complement of filter lands. We have Mystic Gates, we have Rugged Prairie, and we have Cascade Bluffs. These are going to tap for a colorless mana, or we're going to feed 1 mana of a color that they can produce for a combination of any 2 that the land could produce. So, for example, we'll throw a white mana into Mystic Gate, tap it, and then we can produce 2 white, 2 blue, or 1 of each. The cycle of filter lands will help us to fix the mana we need to cast those spells that have the multiple colored mana symbols in them that are so powerful in conjunction with Hinata. And the last cycle we have, we're going to play with a few fetch lands here. We've got the Flooded Strand, we've got the Arid Mesa, and we have the Scalding Tarn. These are going to help to fetch out our shock lands. These will help us to get our basics. And as we're going to see very shortly, they're going to help us fetch out land target number 1 if we do have a fetch land in our opening hand. So let's get to the next set of lands. These are the lands that are going to give us 1 mana of any color, hopefully. And I stress hopefully with respect to one of the additions. First, the best land in our format, Command Tower. This is going to go in there. I mean, every commander deck outside of monocolor should probably play with a Command Tower. The aforementioned target number 1 for any early to mid-game shot or fetch land play should be the Rogwan Triome. It is an Island Mountains Plains. It's going to come into play tapped, but it is fetchable with any of the 3 fetch lands we already talked about. This is the best turn 1 play we can make. We pop down a fetch land, we put out the Rogwan Triome, and now we have 1 mana of each of the colors that we need. That this really helps us to shore up, particularly if we have any of our check lands that are going to come down too. They're going to see that we have the appropriate basic land type, and they're going to come into play untapped. Mana Confluence is going to act as Command Tower 2.0, except each time we activate it, it's going to cost us 1 life. Gemstone Mine is going to come down into play with 3 mining counters on it, and we're going to tap it to remove 1 of them to add 1 mana of any color to our mana pool. And when this runs out of counter, it runs out of use and it will go to the graveyard. So the clock is ticking with Gemstone Mine, so we have to keep that in mind, that when we have it on the battlefield, use it as a must ability. Don't use it just to trifle with it and throw it away. And the last of the lands that could give us 1 mana of any color, it's our Felwar Stone in land form, and that's Exotic Orchard. Same thing with Felwar Stone. We are hoping that Exotic Orchard could become one of those lands that gives us minimally 1 to 2 colors. We're hoping at a table of Commander we can see a lot of white, blue, or red. Maybe not too much blue. Let's not go too far with that. But at the moment, from a personal standpoint, for the purposes of where I am with building this deck, Exotic Orchard is a placeholder for a down-the-road reflecting pool. All right, we are down to our last 3 lands, 97 through 100 of the, 96 through 99, 97, 98, 99 of the 99, and each of these lands give us colorless mana, but their utility is most important. The first is going to be Reliquary Tower. As you've seen throughout this deck tech, we have various ways to get a lot of cards into our hand, and we don't want to discard them down because we have to have the maximum hand of 7. Reliquary Tower will give us the option of keeping all those cards in our hand and not have to sacrifice them to discard. Utility land number 2 is Temple of the False God. If, and this is one of those if scenarios, that we have to take into account. We have put in a great deal of protection for Hinata, but we also have to keep in mind that if for some reason we just can't access Hinata as much as we want, we have to have some contingency plans in place as a way in which to maximize the X spells and the mana, the X, to maximize the X mana and the X spells that we've included in the deck if we don't have Hinata. Temple of the False God will give us 2 colorless mana. It's not going to exactly bridge the gap of its loss, but it is going to help. And lastly, card number 99 of the 99 of this deck, it is Urza's Saga. It's going to come down with a lore counter on it and give us a colorless mana. Lore counter number 2 will give us a colorless mana and allow us to create a construct artifact creature token. It'll get +1/+1 for each other artifact we control. This is not a dedicated artifact build. However, it would be nice to have some sort of protection in place if needed. That option is always available to us. And then lastly, when the third lore counter comes down, this gets sacrificed, and then we search our library for an artifact card with a mana cost of 0 or 1, and we put it onto the battlefield. This will make sure that we have a Soul Ring in play when we have to sacrifice the Urza's Saga. All right, folks, that is it. This is Hinata Dawncrown in a Jeskai build that is taking full advantage of Hinata's cost reduction abilities. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.